gets, the more protected we all are against some very serious diseases. Pretty cool, right?
Joining me now is Dr. Eleanor Draeger, an expert on sexual health who advocates making vaccination compulsory. We also have with us Professor Beate Kampmann, Director of the Vaccine Centre at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And joining us too, Samantha Vanderslott, researcher at the Oxford Vaccine Group. Thank you all for coming, and I want to ask you all first, do you believe this is the time for childhood vaccinations to be made compulsory? Eleanor?
Yes, I do. So my position is that I believe that vaccination should be compulsory for entry to school or nursery. So that if you haven't had your child vaccinated and you don't have a valid medical reason for that to be the case, that you couldn't then send your children to school.
Beate?
I believe that we should really win the argument by persuasion rather than coercion. And my position is, as a doctor, as a mother, and as a clinician and scientist, to persuade with the right arguments that vaccines are life-saving interventions that everybody should have a right to take up.
Samantha, where do you sit on this?
Generally, I would say that I'm in favour of not having compulsory vaccination, although I think it does depend on the country context and the specific circumstances where you might need to consider it if there is an outbreak.
So, Eleanor, if it's not a one-size-fits-all, perhaps, which countries have taken this step, which is a big step in societal terms?
It's a big step. So there are various things that you can do in order to incentivise vaccination in any compulsory system. So in Italy, they've just straightforward made it compulsory. So if your children are not vaccinated by a certain age, then you're fined. In Australia, they've got two different systems, and one is called no jab, no pay, where you are denied certain child benefit if you haven't vaccinated. But you're not fined, they just don't give you money if you haven't vaccinated. And no jab, no play, which is where you can't send your child to school or nursery unless they have a valid medical exemption certificate.
And do you think that's powerful, that's effective?
Yes, and research has shown that is effective, and that after the implementation of these policies, vaccination rates in unvaccinated children has risen in Italy and in Australia.
Don't those facts speak for themselves?
Right. I think the first thing, as Samantha already alluded to, the problem isn't the same in every single setting. The majority of people, especially in the world, and we're on BBC World Service here, actually do vaccinate their children. They believe completely that vaccines are safe and effective, and they take them up and they actually queue up to get them. And the reason why 220 million people in the world are not vaccinated is because they don't have the access, rather than never or refused. So I think one needs to really look at the context of the situation where people are in. I have seen people faking certificates for showing apparently that they were vaccinated. As a practicing paediatrician, I actually operate in a sphere of trust, hopefully, with my patients, and I would like them to tell me if they're worried, but also maybe I would have to do better in addressing issues that they might have that they might not have told me about, and that's, I think, the way we should go.
Trust is a really important word, isn't it? It's something that is missing in this sphere to some extent.
Yes, I think it's really important because, well, actually, you want to increase the trust between the government and the population, and having a coercive measure like this, what's to say the next government being elected in has a non-compulsory vaccination policy and they get voted in. So I think it's not as easy to say we can make vaccination compulsory and that ends the conversation, because it will carry on, and this is what researchers are worried about, potential pushback if people feel like they're not being listened to.
But Beate, I want to come back to you on this because our global health correspondent, Philippa Thomas, was saying to me a little earlier, it is and it isn't a personal decision, because, you know, without herd immunity, often it's the very young babies who get, as you know, get something like measles and die because their older siblings aren't vaccinated.
I mean, you're absolutely right. There is a dilemma here, or a potential discussion between what is the personal right to a free decision and what's the public health imperative. And obviously, as you know, everyone in the room here will agree, the public health imperative is hugely important. And what we've seen with the measles outbreaks in European countries recently, and the public health imperative might direct decision making. In France, for example, another 11 vaccines were, or another 8 were made compulsory, although they already had 3 that were always compulsory. So it wasn't completely a new process. And what they also did in France, enter into a societal dialogue about the issue. And I think that's maybe a step that one should also consider.
I mean, we are talking about trust, we're talking about dialogue, and Eleanor, I suppose there is, you could make the case, couldn't you, that, you know, if you're pregnant, you get vaccines, or you give teenagers vaccines, that they can come to be accepted. It's a question of changing cultural comfort in a way.
I agree, and what I'd like to see is a multi-pronged approach. So it's not as simple as saying, oh, it must be compulsory for you to go to school. We also need to carry on doing the things that have already been done. So Facebook is now banning anti-vax messages, and Instagram are blocking hashtags which are fake news about vaccines. So we do need a lot of that to happen as well. And I agree with you about trust. We don't want a breakdown in trust. And that's partly why my sort of compromise position, as it were, is that by saying that you can't send your children to school unless you've been vaccinated, parents still have free choice. They can choose to home educate their children if they specifically don't want them to be vaccinated for a non-medical reason.
If you're talking about who's responsible for getting the right messages out there, I know, Samantha, that you've looked at this issue of, you know, again, we often say this, should the social media giants be made responsible for example, blocking fake news about vaccines?
Yeah, so there are really strong calls for social media companies to deal with misinformation, and we have seen a response. So Pinterest, for example, has banned any search results if you put in vaccines. So that's a more extreme, that's an extreme response. But I think it's not addressing the underlying issues. So we can ban certain activity, but it doesn't stop it from happening. And
what do you do, Beate, in terms, I know that you've thought a lot about the messaging here.
Sure. I mean, you know, there is a personal perspective, there's a global perspective, there's a social media perspective. The problem is, at the moment, we're in this U-shaped curve of people relating to information. It used to be much more bell-shaped, and people would, you know, there'd be extremes at the end. But now the people on one side of the curve only talk to the people on the one side of the curve. And I think that's throwing us challenges which are actually beyond just the issue of vaccination. But I don't want to distract from the subject.
But you're right, it's about trust in science and trust in expertise as well.
And it's one of the things that came out of the Wellcome Trust report, which was really well done, that it's not just about confidence in vaccines, it reflects confidence in systems. And in fact, the majority of people still trust the information they get from healthcare professionals. And then after that is actually the information from families. And that's where and families and friends. And that's, I think, where we have to maybe make information a bit more accessible, or take people where they come from, also not forgetting that actually it is a really minority of people who are very vocal, making a lot of noise, and probably having created this group of people, that might be only 14 or 15%, who are really sort of not sure what to do, whilst the majority of people, they do vaccinate.
But for that minority, and we've established that the minority can then affect the rest of you know, the society as a whole. I mean, what do you do in terms of you're getting families over the threshold or to the health worker? What more can you do? I mean, you don't put huge pictures of syringes on your website, for example, do you?
For example, I think, you know, showing pictures of children being attacked by literally spears is completely inappropriate. And when I see that, you know, I'm much happier with this picture than the other pictures on the website earlier, with again showing a smiling nurse bombarding a small child who was grimacing and looking miserable.
It doesn't have to be a big syringe anymore.
It doesn't have to be like that. And I think also, you know, we need to do much more granular work in the countries where this has become much more important issue. I don't want to negate the issue, but the reasons why people don't vaccinate their children in Ukraine might be very different from the reasons why people have chosen not to vaccinate in France. And even in the UK, from our own research conducted around women who are taking up vaccines in pregnancy or don't take up vaccines in pregnancy, we've done a lot of focus group work trying to understand what stops them taking them up. And we have designed an app, for example, that lets women access information at their own pace with their smartphone, which is informed by scientists from our research group. So I think we need to build trust with materials that are kind of maybe driven a bit more bottom up rather than top down.
Eleanor, what's your thoughts about that, driving the message bottom up?
Well, I'd like to do both. I completely agree that we do need to do that, but unfortunately sometimes legislation is the only way to change things. So as an example, seatbelts. When I was a child, people never wore seatbelts. Then it was legislated for, now everyone wears a seatbelt.
But the
And
legislation came first.
the legislation was a driver to it. Lots of people wore seatbelts before the legislation, but not enough people to save enough lives. Once the legislation came in, the vast majority of people wear seatbelts, and that has saved countless more lives. I'm sure there were people who were anti-seatbelts at the time that the legislation came out, just as there have been anti-vaxxers since the time of the smallpox vaccine being developed.
And Samantha, I know you've been looking at responses and emotional approaches to this. It is a hugely emotive topic, isn't it? Because when you think about whether to vaccinate or not to vaccinate, there's often a lot else around that decision, isn't there?
Yeah, so you do see parents who have experienced a vaccine preventable disease actually speaking out now, and they're forming groups online and where they're promoting vaccination.
What I wish I'd known, that kind of
Yeah,
thought.
exactly. What I wish I'd known, or because their child was too young to be vaccinated for a certain disease, and they've been a silent majority, really. The people who do normally vaccinate or are supportive of vaccination, and it's that very vocal opposition to vaccination that's getting their views across, and not people who generally go about their business and vaccinate.
We've just got about a minute left. I want to ask you all, what do you think is the single most important thing in getting a message that you all believe in through?
So I would say that trust your sources. So have a look at where you're getting your information from and decide whether it's a credible source or not. And that means going beyond the surface and actually wondering what are the motives of this person or this organisation that are promoting views that aren't in line with a public health message that we've been used to.
Dig into your sources.
Yeah.
Beate?
Vaccinating is definitely safer than not vaccinating.
Okay, that's simple, memorable. Eleanor, what's the single most important thing, do you think?
I think we should move forward and try to eradicate measles in the way that we eradicated smallpox.
Okay, thank you all very much for joining in this debate. Just to say that quite a few of you have been messaging, you have been tweeting me, and we will look at what you've been saying in the next edition of Impact, and we'll have more as well on our top stories, on our developing news about the charges of 4 suspects for the MH17 Malaysia air crash. So much more still to come, all after Sport Today, which is coming up next. And as I say, you can keep those messages coming through to me. I'm at Philippa BBC. It's always a lively debate, and we do want to reflect some of the views that you're sending to us here on BBC World News.